audio. But I want to dig in. There's been a last minute change to SAQ-A eligibility criteria. This was an announcement made by the PCI Security Standards Council yesterday. I want to talk a little bit about what it means, what it doesn't. I want to talk a little bit about what various different stakeholders are thinking and the questions that it has kicked up into the atmosphere, and try and address as much from our perch as we can with respect to an evaluation on it, and then advice for all those that are on the call here. I do see that we've got a number of QSAs on the call who I know fairly well. I do want to kind of get to a Q&A, on the back half of this thing. Feel free to chime in if you have your own knee-jerk reactions and assessments, and let's have a dialogue here. But let's talk about it. So real quick, just to give some of those on the call an understanding of who we are, for those that don't know us. Source Defense, we're the pioneer in eSkimming security, basically protecting data at the point of capture. Web security technology, really purpose built to stop the eSkimming threat. And for the better part of the last 4 years, we've been working with the PCI Council and with stakeholders across the payments ecosystem to help address data security, data privacy, and the compliance requirements outlined in PCI DSS 4.001, 6.4.3, and 11.6.1. We are PCI PPO. We have been PPO, or what's called a principal participating organization, for the last couple of years. That means we are involved in a number of different things with respect to standards development, and specifically have been involved in the Small Merchant Task Force and in the what they call the ECommerce Guidance Taskforce, which was impaneled back in October. We've been active with the council for 4 years. As I mentioned a minute ago, we've seen the insides of these discussions, especially related to what was announced yesterday. And so I'm going to give a little bit of perspective, from that perch. We're also a PCI certified third-party service provider. And so, we know the domain fairly well. What we are not is we are not QSAs. What we are not, we're not a merchant acquirer. We're a vendor in the space. And so I want to table, our statements by saying, if you do need to speak with, an expert around how they're going to interpret your own use of SAQ-A, I would defer you to, if you're a SAQ-A merchant that uses an AOC, to your QSA. And as I mentioned, we've got a good group of QSAs on the call today, so they can hopefully provide some advice as well. But we've done a bunch of stuff to help the community over the last couple of years. Those things remain in place, and I just wanted to make sure you were aware of them. One reason we're holding this webinar is we do believe in the community, and we believe in doing this, for the effort, which is to stop the eSkimming threat. And we've spent a lot of time working to try and educate, and so we'll do our best in response to this guidance as well. So what just happened, right? Let's do a little bit of a breakdown on the changes that were announced yesterday by the PCI Security Standards Council related to SAQ-A eligibility. And so self-assessment questionnaire, right? SAQ-A eligibility. The announcement basically has changed the eligibility criteria, and it has made a modification in scope for SAQ-A merchants. So effective April 1st is when these changes go in effect. There are now 2 forms of the SAQ-A that are out on the PCI standards website, one which was published in October, and one which was published yesterday. If you're mid-flight, can still use the one that was published in October. The new changes will not go into effect until April 1st, but there are significant changes that come with it, and you really need to understand what they are. The scope only changes for 6.4.3 and 11.6.1 under SAQ-A eligibility. And that's a very, very important, point to make, is that the only thing that's changed and that is changing is related to SAQ-A eligibility. This was actually announced to the eCommerce Guidance Taskforce, but it was not a product of that effort. I want to make sure that's clear. There are about 70 or 80 different stakeholders involved in the EGTF. Our charter on that task force was not, is not, and has never been to change or modify the PCI DSS. And I know that there's a lot of misinformation that was kicked into the atmosphere and a lot of confusion that was kicked into the atmosphere a couple of months ago when the council put out a blog and stated that an e-commerce guidance task force document would be coming. The document is not working on changes to the standard. So what we've been told and what we understand is that no additional changes will be coming from the EGTF effort. And that guidance document is simply that. It's a guidance document. It was meant and is intended, and the content that we've written there, to provide insights to merchants and to QSAs and to PSPs around, how to approach the controls under 643 and 11.6.1, not to change them. I've had multiple conversations with people who've said, well, there's changes coming, and even since yesterday, well, because they changed SAQ-A eligibility, it must mean there's going to be more changes coming to 640 and 11.6 and 11.6.1. That is not the case, at least not based on anything that we've been told. And you should not be waiting for this document to come out, because it won't be, tablets coming from the Temple Mount, and it won't change anything, especially won't change the March deadline requirement. Okay. The new eligibility language has been added to SAQ-A after this announcement yesterday. And basically, the statement is, the PCI SSC is making the following updates to SAQ-A. The removal of requirements 643 and 11.6.1 for payment page security, and requirement 12.3.1 for a TRA, or target risk analysis, to support requirement 11.6.1. The addition of an eligibility criteria for merchants to confirm their site, and this is in quotes, their site is not susceptible to attacks from scripts that could affect the merchant's e-commerce systems. Okay. That, was a big bone of contention in terms of the change to the language, but let's go through and talk through what this basically says. 643, 11.6.1, 12.3.1 removed as compliance requirements for SAQ-A eligible merchants, but changes to the eligibility requirements. 643 and 11.6.1 remain a requirement for all other merchants, any of the other forms of SAQ, and definitely anybody, in the level 1 ROC. The deadline does not change. It is still March 31st, 2025. Okay. New eligibility language added to the SAQ-A, in my opinion, in our opinion, in the opinion of those that have been part of this thing, does not, and I want to emphasize it, does not de-emphasize the need to secure against eSkimming. We actually believe it moves the goalposts and may even increase scope. And I'll talk about that here in just a second. What the actual eligibility requirements are can be found on the newly published document that's out on the PCI SSC document library. I'll go through that with you. It basically, in our opinion, has now made it much more difficult to use SAQ-A. I know that there are some large merchants in the past that have used the SAQ-A. I think the eligibility criteria are now incredibly stringent. And even for those that are in the small merchant category who previously relied on SAQ-A, I think the change to the language raises the bar in such a way that there's going to be some difficulty. But effectively, SAQ-A eligibility has always meant that you cannot be a multi-channel merchant. The first bullet here states that the merchant accepts only card not present e-commerce or mail / telephone order transactions. So, that right there should disqualify anybody who's got a multi-channel environment. All processing must be completely outsourced to the TPSP or the PSP. And so all account data is entirely outsourced to a compliant party. The merchant cannot electronically store, process, or transmit any account data. They must rely entirely on a PSP. Any account data that is retained is only on paper. And then the big ones related to the eSkimming side of things, all elements of the payment pages / forms delivered to the customer's browser originate only and directly from the PSP or the TPSP. So if you have a website where the payment page itself is not completely and entirely delivered from the PCI DSS compliant TPSP or PSP, you are not in scope for SAQ-A. And the addition of this language says the merchant has confirmed that their site is not susceptible to attacks from scripts that could affect the merchant's e-commerce systems. So all of this change that's kicked up in the atmosphere, what does it really mean as it relates to, the requirements to address the eSkimming threat? From our perspective and the way we're reading it and many others are reading it, the eSkimming security requirements for SAQ-A don't go away. They don't disappear. In fact, all they're taking away are the specific requirements under 643 and 11.6.1 that call for inventory, justification of scripts, weekly HTTP header scans, the targeted risk analysis. All that's gone. But if you read the language, and language is very important, and especially I know the QSAs that are on this call will tell you there's a lot of interpretive dancing that goes around with the way words are used and how they're used. Our read on it is the standard previously stated that what's in scope is payment pages. But the language now in SAQ-A eligibility specifically states that their site, okay, I'll go back to it real quick, okay, the merchant has confirmed that their site, it does not say that their payment pages, but that their site is not susceptible to attacks from scripts that could affect the merchant's e-commerce systems. Okay, so we believe that actually has an increased scope result or impact, making it now a requirement for SAQ-A eligible merchants to somehow prove that the entirety of their site is not susceptible to script-borne attacks, or i.e. eSkimming. So in our opinion, qualifying for a SAQ-A just became incredibly more difficult. And as a result, if not SAQ-A, if you can't qualify for SAQ-A, or if you're a QSA, you're wondering whether or not a merchant qualifies or not, you're going to have to divert them off either to another form of a SAQ, or they're going to have to go full-blown ROC. And in those cases, 643, 11.6.1, and 12.3 apply. So it's almost like a circular firing squad, a lot of circular reasoning going on. It's very, very confusing. It's why we wanted to pull this thing together right now. I'm sure that there will be many days of dialogue around this. But our key takeaways on it are, to be eligible for a SAQ-A, a merchant must meet all the requirements and be able to attest to the fact that their site, not their payment page, is not susceptible to eSkimming attacks. And when we look at language in the DSS, the default is, definitions that are aligned to NIST CSF. Susceptibility under CSF is defined as the inability to avoid adversity. So you flip that around, not susceptible must mean proof, right, that you can avoid adversity from these forms of attacks. So some form of control will need to be in place, regardless if you're a SAQ-A merchant or whether you're, another classification. And so therefore, and this is like the head scratcher, C643 and 11.6.1 and operate accordingly. Now, maybe some of the controls under 643 and 11.6.1 are more onerous for a small merchant. Those that will get into the actual documentation and ongoing compliance management end of things. But there's great guidance under 643 and 11.6.1 on how to do the above. In other words, how to prevent eSkimming attacks. So it's a lot. It's a big move that was made with not a lot of justification and reasoning behind it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And, our best advice is don't move off the path you've already been on for the last couple of years. We've got 59 days to go before these controls, which were future dated for 2 years, and many organizations, have been working to deploy, are required. And so stay that course. Obviously, QSA supporting SAQ-A AOCs are going to need to provide their clients guidance as to whether or not they're still SAQ-A eligible. And if they are SAQ-A eligible, or you believe they are, the only way they can be SAQ-A eligible is if you have some form of proof that some form of script control is in place, or that other compensating controls are in place, such that the scripts running on the site, not the payment pages, but the site, can't be compromised. So I think that our best advice, again, our perch is one, sort of as a player in the ecosystem, not as, a compliance, reporting entity or as a QSA, but our best advice is plug forward and, keep focusing on this as a security threat and the reason for why we're doing it, versus, getting into the weeds on the change in compliance management. Another thought here is that, statements, have been made in the blog that was released yesterday, that compliance enforcing entities, effectively, the buck's going to stop with them. The compliance validation requirements are set by the brands, acquirers, payment facilitators, et cetera, which are often referred to as compliance enforcing entities. Organizations must consult with their compliance enforcing entity if they have any questions regarding PCI DSS compliance validation or the applicable validation tools that they may be eligible to use. I bring that up to say I know there's some folks on here that are either acquirers or in the PSP world or whatever. Small merchants are going to turn to you for guidance on what to do here. The very small merchant community that had been eligible for SAQ-A may not be any longer. They're going to look for you to help them figure out what to do and to maintain that SAQ-A eligibility. And I think the answer has got to be work to bring solutions to bear for them, that help keep them in that category. Do not simply accept checkbox. Well, they fill the box out, and we're not going to check it because that does nothing to draw the systemic risk out of this eSkimming threat, the fraud that's being seen, the attacks, the identity theft that's associated with it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's our take on it. It's about 20 minutes in here. I know that there are folks on here. I want to offer an opportunity to either chime in with their own opinions or with any questions. But that's kind of, the knee-jerk quick take from just about, 24 hours from now, from this announcement being made. So let's go. I know I've got a bunch in the Q&A. Okay, yeah, the audio is distorted. Hopefully that got better. I have a number of level 1 merchants that are now pushing back on these requirements since their SAQ-A e-commerce basically told them that, one, their assessments are all due before March 31st, so they're not affected by this. However, the new criterion was added. I have no idea what evidence a QSA can accept to meet that the third party is not susceptible to script injections. Yes, sir. Jeff, I hear you. I think that has been a primary response that we've seen just in the last, in the chat on this EGTF task force, in the last, 24 to 48 hours on this. Again, defer to, my thinking, which is, if we're out there and you as QSA, need to provide guidance, the standard has very, very well constructed thoughts on how to address eSkimming. It's 643 and 11.6.1, and I, my take would be defer back. Ignore this and defer back. Is the SAQ-A EP staying the same? We have some customers who get SAQ-A confused with SAQ-A EAP. To my knowledge, that is correct. This is the only changes being made specifically to the SAQ-A. Again, I don't work for the council, but this is what we've been told, is that this is just going to be a SAQ-A change, and that it will not impact other forms of the SAQ. Level 1 merchants can only use SAQ-A for scoping the assessment. Doesn't cause the ROC to only follow those requirements in SAQ-A. Duly noted and agreed. And so, but I think it's one of these, another, sort of chasing the tail. If I'm scoping for SAQ-A and SAQ-A says this, then what? And so I think, it's the mayhem that is caused by some of this. Let's see. The problem with the new criteria, particularly merchants that are truly totally outsourced. What's the evidence that the PSP provides? I totally agree with that. That I think is the next step, the day 2 on this, which is to say, okay, so all right, TPSPs, all right, PSPs, right? What is it the requirement going to be for these merchants, right, to ensure that the statement is validated, right? That their sites are not susceptible to script-borne attacks, right? I believe that the use of their site is due to SAQ-A merchants not actually having payment pages defined in the DSS glossary. Now, the old SAQ has an exception that says they will still need to do for pages that hold deny frame, even those pages are not payment pages. Okay, yep, and this is flowing at me, and I'm trying to read all these things as fast as I can. I think you might have a point there with respect to their site, because when you think about the true eligibility criteria, under SAQ-A, right? We'll go back to it. It should be that, let's see, all elements of the payment page forms delivered to the customer's browser originate only and directly from a PCI compliant TPSP or payment processor. However, there are SAQ-A merchants, that have scripts running that are not provided, or that the site is not fully outsourced to, and I think that's what causes the scope concern. But Kyle, we should talk about that offline. Definitely drop me a note so I can get my head around your thinking a little bit better. Okay, let's see. Okay, all right, cool. Okay. FAQ 1331 SAQ-A in ROC is really muddled. Yep, there needs to be an update to the FAQ. That has been a very loud cry, from the feedback that's been going on. We have not heard any response as to whether or not there will be a change to the FAQ. And so for those invoking 1331, what does that mean? It pops back over to the SAQ-A. It's FUBAR is the acronym that comes best to my mind. All right. Okay, let's see. I think I got to most of those. Are there any other comments or questions or other things that people want to talk about in this setting right now? I'll stick around for a couple more minutes on that front. If you're a large merchant, you're a level one, and you're like wondering, okay, what comes next? Again, I would tell you that what we've heard is there's no other changes forthcoming. And, it's the position of the council that actually this is not a change to the DSS. It's simply a change to the SAQ-A eligibility criteria. Debatable, right? Whether or not that's the word, I guess it's a definition of the word change. But we've been told, and we know for a fact, that our charter on the EGTF was not to change anything about 643.11.6.1. Okay. And so if you're a large merchant that's waiting, stop waiting, get moving, talk to your QSA. The threat is real. The risk is real. A great bit of research just came out from Recorded Future not more than a week ago, talking to the problem. We've had 2.5 years, to get this done. Let's just get it done. It's basically the best advice that I can give. Okay. Recording, absolutely. We'll send a recording in the PowerPoint. Scott will help me get that done. Probably no later than by Monday, but hopefully today. What evidence can a TPSP provide to their SAQ-A customers? I heard it's unclear. It's completely unclear. If you remove the requirements of 643 and 11.6.1, then what are you left with for validation? And so that's where I just default back to, follow those. I mean, I guess you have the ability to pick and choose now which elements of 643 and 11.6.1 matter. Again, only in SAQ-A environments. But this is something we're all going to have to figure out. And that's, I think one of the reasons I wanted to jump in here, because I'm sure there's a million of these questions going on in everybody's minds right now. Okay, I think that I've probably exhausted the extent of knowledge on the subject that we have for right now. I appreciate you guys all jumping on here. Anybody who wants to reach out individually, please do. It's super easy. It's just steve@sourcedefense.com. steve@sourcedefense.com. See a lot of people that we know on this call, and a lot of merchants, a lot of people all across the table. Drop us a line. Let's have a dialogue on it. I'll respond back, and I'll definitely pull in more technical people than me, to support any questions that you guys have. But ever forward, I guess, is the best advice that I would give, and I would say, it's a matter of doing the right thing here. This doesn't, again, impact anybody in the broader sense. It's supposed to be only for the SAQ-A merchant, but I understand the complexities that come with that. So ever forward, let's get it done together, and you guys have a great Friday, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much for coming.